Before we begin tonight, we'd like to take a moment to think about Sunday night's horrific attack in Las Vegas.
At least 59 people are dead and 527 people are injured after a gunman opened fire on a country music festival.
This massacre is officially the deadliest mass shooting in modern American history, surpassing the Orlando nightclub shooting in June of 2016.
We have made the editorial decision not to politicize Las Vegas on our show this evening to allow the victims, friends, and loved ones time to grieve.
Tonight, the thoughts of the entire Politicat team are with everyone involved in this senseless act of violence.
Good evening and welcome to Politicat. I'm Tyler Kendall.
And I'm Andrew Merica. Tonight on our show, we'll be discussing important topics related to the Supreme Court, Senate primaries, and the new GOP tax reform plan. But first, this week's headlines.
Over 90% of voters in Catalonia voted to secede from Spain to create an independent nation. The Spanish government insists that Sunday's referendum was illegal as well as unrepresentative. Over 2 million voters defied a tough police crackdown to cast their ballots. Since the vote, tensions in the province have flared, with clashes and riots turning violent between the Spanish police and Catalonians.
Tensions between the U.S. and North Korea continue to rise as diplomats from both countries conduct a war of words, slinging threats and calling each other names over the dictatorship's rapidly progressing nuclear weapons program. President Trump on Sunday said that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is, quote, wasting his time trying to negotiate with North Korea.
Tom Price becomes the latest member of the Trump administration to resign. The Health and Human Services Secretary stepped down Friday after public outcry over his use of private jet travel on the taxpayer's dime. Price, a former congressman from Georgia, also reportedly fell out of President Trump's good graces after failing to deliver a health care repeal.
The Supreme Court kicks off a new term. The first full term for Justice Neil Gorsuch, who was appointed by President Trump in April, began yesterday. Today, the court heard a case that has the potential to have a broad impact on local and national politics, Gill versus Whitford. The case deals with gerrymandering, the practice of drawing legislative districts in certain ways to gain a partisan advantage. Specifically, the case looks at the state of Wisconsin, which a lower court found had a significantly higher number of GOP winning candidates in 2012 than it had votes for GOP candidates. And to discuss the case and more, we'll bring in our panel. Tonight we have Rachel Frazin. She's the managing editor for North by Northwestern. And we've got David Gernon. He's the editor-in-chief for Politics and Policy. Rachel, David, thank you guys for being here.
We're glad to be here. Thanks, Andrew.
All right. Initial reports look like Justice Kennedy could be the deciding factor here. We'll start with you, David. Is that how you see this case playing out?
Well, you know, Justice Kennedy is the swing vote in a lot of these cases just from the ideological makeup of the court. So it wouldn't surprise me at all to see that be the case, Andrew.
All right. Rachel?
I don't know. In a lot of these, like David said, in a lot of these hyper-partisan cases, that is what happens. However, there are a lot of cases often cases that are not as in the news as much, where it's like a 9-0 vote. So I think it sort of depends on the legalities as well as the politics.
So you think that Kennedy, as he has been in the past, could probably?
He could be the swing vote if it is sort of up in the air legally and it comes down to sort of moral feelings. But I think that in a lot of Supreme Court cases, if the legality is clearly on one side, it might not necessarily be a 5-4 split.
All right.
Right, and now another justice that we're all curious about for this is Justice Gorsuch. Do any of you think we're going to see any surprises from him?
Well, I think Justice Gorsuch has surprised a few people in his short time on the court already. He's been given some eloquent monologues, and he's spoken out quite a bit despite being the youngest member on the court. Just today I read a report that he was speaking and Justice Ginsburg actually sort of silenced him by correcting a little bit one of his kind of legal thoughts, and after that he didn't speak for the rest of the day. So, we'll see, I guess, if he gets his momentum back in the coming days.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It might be because he feels new. It might be. I actually think there was a study possibly done at Northwestern a couple of years ago that in courts in general, male justices speak way more than female justices. So as he becomes more comfortable on the court, I wonder if that trend will continue. But as of right now, we can't say.
All right, that's fair. It's only his second day of this new
Yeah.
term. So let's talk about gerrymandering itself. The political advantages are clear, right? Somebody gets a partisan advantage. But how can they justify that in front of the Supreme Court, David? Like, what are the arguments here in favor of the gerrymandering?
Sure, right. Well, I think a strong case can be made that it's sort of not the Supreme Court's business, I suppose, to get into this business of the states. Of course, the districts are drawn by state legislatures with no bearing, sort of at the national level. And I think that seems like the way this case is going. Obviously, if a power isn't explicitly given to the federal government or the Supreme Court, then it is left up to the states. And so I think that's maybe where this, where the defense for this case will lie, is that it's not explicitly, given to the federal government to, or the Supreme Court to sort of rule on this type of issue.
I disagree. I actually think there is an argument that I think might be a little bit better than that in favor, but I also think that there are a lot of arguments against what you just said. The argument in favor, I think, is that places change, populations change, demographics shift, and I think that again, when the founders were crafting or when people were starting with censuses and things like that, what they had in mind was the voting districts reflecting who's in them, and that should be updated as time goes on. That being said, I think the Supreme Court has jurisdiction over both state and federal cases, and so I think that you can't really say that the Supreme Court doesn't have jurisdiction over the states. Like when it takes on a murder case, for example, that's always state v. whoever. Like I believe state v. Miranda was a murder case, and obviously that led to the Miranda rights as a result of Supreme Court decisions. There's a long history of Supreme Court ruling on both state and federal cases.
Right. Do any of you think that this is also primarily an issue of First Amendment rights and the right to vote? Ginsburg today was quoted saying, what about, people's precious right to that?
Oh, absolutely. I think that different people's votes count different amounts, and not just in this system, in a ton of systems that we have here in the United States, such as the Electoral College or even the Senate itself. You could argue that some people's votes count more than other people's votes, and that's really unfair. I think, I think when they said everyone has the right to vote, they meant, or at least they should have meant, that everyone has an equal right to vote. I don't think that where you live or what race you are or anything like that should have any bearing on how much your vote counts.
And now it also seems like the conversation usually focuses on gerrymandering that helps the GOP. So does it help the GOP more often than Democrats, and why one way or the other?
Sure. Well, I think that's a product of sort of the recency of a lot of these cases. Of course, every 10 years it's redrawn based on the census, and so in 2010, the Tea Party sort of came to prominence as a backlash to the beginning years of the Obama administration, and so of course the GOP had control of a lot of state legislatures, and thus the ability to redraw the districts kind of as they saw fit, and so this is sort of the result of that now. The GOP is maybe running into some troubles with that. Obviously, we have this case in the Supreme Court, and now, it's one of Obama's big things now that he's out of office. Him and Eric Holder and others are working on, for the next census 2020, kind of being in a position of power in terms of redrawing the next districts. Hopefully, maybe this case can sort of set some sort of permanent decision on that.
I think race is also a big factor here. I think that the GOP's base is largely white, and I think that Democrats, a lot of their base is black people and other minorities, and I think that these are the people who are systematically disadvantaged by gerrymandering, and so I think in Republicans, they're trying to get more power, obviously, with their own power and their gerrymandering. Those are the ones that draw on racial lines, and I think then that attracts more news, because I think it is more problematic, because that's who their base is.
All right. Well, that'll do it for this segment. Coming up next, our panel will weigh in on the fallout from the Alabama Senate primary. This is Politicat. Stay with us.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Cheer you all the go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory. Sweet victory, spread for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game.
No, that's 3.
Go Cats!
What?
Roy Moore won Alabama's Senate primary runoff last week despite not having President Trump's blessing. Moore defeated incumbent Senator Luther Strange by over 10 percentage points. As former Supreme Court Justice of Alabama, Moore was suspended twice for refusing to obey laws he felt conflicted with his religious views. President Trump and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell both favored Strange. We're going to bring back in the panel now. We've got Rachel Frazin and David Gernon. And to start out, why did President Trump's coattails prove shorter than expected in a state he won heavily during the 2016 race? Why wasn't his support able to propel the candidate that he supported to win this primary? Rachel, any thoughts?
I mean, I think that the candidate he was supporting was the candidate who, in the race itself, was less like him, less bombastic, more sort of quiet and eloquent and established. And was an establishment figure. And I think that the voting in of Trump was sort of an anti-establishment, one for that lack of political correctness. And I think that showed in the voting. So I don't think that shows any change in what voters want in Alabama.
Well, and I think you can't discount, the fact that the seat that they're running to replace was, of course, held by Jeff Sessions, and he's certainly been no favorite son of President Trump thus far. There's been lots of stories of President Trump publicly and privately berating the Attorney General Sessions, and so, maybe that doesn't play too well in his home state of Alabama.
And Sessions also isn't exactly a moderate.
Yeah, so you think that it really Sessions plays a lot into this and the view of him in that state?
Well, you'd have to wonder if, seeing the president bash your senator, your former senator, probably doesn't endear his endorsement to a ton of people. And I think Rachel's right in that Roy Moore maybe displayed a lot more Trumpian characteristics than Luther Strange. At one of the rallies in the lead up to the vote, even Trump said, maybe I backed the wrong guy or something along those lines. So pretty, timid endorsement, I would say, from the president.
And something interesting about why this race kind of shook out like it did was, according to the U.S. Census, Alabama has one of the lowest percentages of college-educated adults. And as that percentage of those with a college degree dropped among counties, so did Strange's support. So now this becomes important for 2018, right? Because in the 9 states that Republicans are defending, all of them except for Utah have college education rates below the national average of 30%. So what kind of candidates do you think we'll see in the future? Are these anti-established candidates going to, become the trend? What do you think, Rachel?
I'm not sure. I think that Trump coming in did bring in an era of sort of less PC, more far right, Tea Party, whatever you want to call them, kind of figures. And I think that it very well could. But I am not from any of these states. I have not been to most of these states, so I can't tell you really what's going on the ground.
Sure. I mean, I think if anything, the special election in Alabama will only sort of exasperate that trend, right? I mean, here was the establishment in a lot of ways. President Trump and Mitch McConnell threw, his PAC behind it and a lot of money and endorsements behind it, and he lost, by 10 points. That's a huge defeat. So there's no reason why this wouldn't embolden more sort of outsider candidates to seek the nomination in the coming years. And on top of that, there's been all these special elections that have been held in the country, obviously, following the election. And, the Republicans have done very well in all of them, or most of them. And so, I think the trend is towards more candidates like that.
So Trump is the establishment in this case. Is that what you're saying? Trump, who ran as Mr. Anti-Establishment, now tables have turned. Is that what we're saying?
Well, it's a tricky situation. I would say, I guess in this race he did back the more establishment candidate, a sitting senator, Luther Strange, and of course Steve Bannon was on the other side, formerly of the White House, but now very much outside the White House, and definitely not establishment.
Right, and so let's talk about that. Steve Bannon, along with Housing Secretary Ben Carson, former Governor of Alaska Sarah Palin, all these people supported Moore. This divisiveness in the GOP has some saying Democratic candidates and former U.S. Attorney Doug Jones has an outside shot at snatching a seat that has not gone to a Democrat since 1996. Joe Biden even visited today to campaign with Jones. Are we going to see a Democratic senator from Alabama, Rachel?
I doubt it. They overwhelmingly voted for Trump. He is, I think, as bad or says similar to this other figure, so I don't see that they would shift now. I think Democrats should focus on their energies on swing states, because I think in a vacuum, at least for right now, the election of this one person doesn't matter so much, because he's still going to be constrained by the more establishment Republicans. He's still going to have to vote along party lines, and this one person doesn't get to make doesn't get to create legislation for the entire country on its own. And so I think that the bigger issue here is the majorities in the House and the Senate, rather than this individual candidate and his sort of ideas that are not in the mainstream.
David, any chance, Democrat, Alabama?
I would say it's unlikely. I mean, Biden there, we'll see what happens, I guess. And there's obviously a lot of enthusiasm towards all the elections now. I'm sure lots of money will pour in there from both sides. But there was Georgia 6 special election, which was supposed to be a somewhat moderate conservative district, and that ended up, not even being too close of a race. Alabama's certainly to the right of that, so to produce a Democratic senator, I think, would be a shock, to me at least.
We have to remember that Trump beat Clinton in Alabama by 28 points, which is a sizable margin. So we're going to end this discussion right here. More Politicat after the break.
At Northwestern, we're wildcats in every way.
Cheer you all the go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, spread for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
The Republicans are moving on to their next big battle in Congress, an issue President Trump ran his campaign on: tax reform. Sunday marked the end of budget reconciliation, and with it, the Republican Party hopes that it could pass an Obamacare repeal with 51 votes.
So now, after months of closed-door working sessions, the president's economic team, along with Republican lawmakers, unveiled a 9-page framework for their upcoming tax legislation. President Trump promised he would cut taxes for the middle class, close loopholes, and make the tax filing process so simple it could fit on an index card.
Let's go now to NNN's Matt Dunn for a closer look on whether the president is pulling through on his promises. Matt?
Well, thank you, Andrew. President Trump unveiled the framework for his ambitious tax plan last week, claiming it will, quote, reduce taxes across the board. Let's take a closer look at what the plan actually involves. President Trump's plan outlines 3 main changes from the current tax code. It's the corporate tax rate, individual tax rates, and taxes on the so-called pass-through businesses. Let's start with the corporate tax rate. The plan aims to reduce it to 20% from 35%. That's higher than the 15% rate the president has long promised. The Nonpartisan Tax Foundation estimates this reduction of the corporate tax rate could cost nearly $1.8 trillion over the next decade. Next up, we have individual tax rates. The plan would reduce and consolidate the individual tax rates into 3 brackets: 12%, 25%, and 35%. Now, our current tax system has 7 brackets, with the lowest being 10% and the highest being just over 39.5%. While it may seem as if the lowest income earners are paying more, that is not immediately clear because the plan calls for a 2-fold increase in the standard deduction as well. Now, the president's plan also aims to increase the child tax credit and create a new tax credit for non-child dependents, such as the elderly. The final component regards S corporations, partnerships, and sole proprietorships, often referred to as those pass-through businesses. About 95% of businesses in the U.S. are structured in this way, and under current law, these businesses are taxed at the rates of their owners. As we know, under the system, rates could rise as high as 39.6%. Under the president's plan, pass-through businesses would be subject to a new flat rate of 25%. Democrats say the plan will disproportionately benefit the rich. Administration officials did not yet provide a cost estimate for the plan, but Republicans say economic growth will compensate for lost revenue. Back to you guys.
All right, thanks, Matt. So now let's head back to our panel. First off, Democrats and Republicans both agree that the current system is far too complicated and creates numerous loopholes. But is this an improvement?
Well, it's tough to say. I mean, I think, as you said, everyone agrees that the current plan is far too complicated, and so any sort of simplification should be an improvement, I would say. It's important to consider that this is just a framework, and so any sort of final version of this could look radically different after lobbying groups and everyone gets their hands on it. And of course, Senator Corker is retiring, a noted deficit hawk, so if this plan calls for sort of any increase in deficit spending, it seems unlikely that he'll be in favor of it, so that's one vote. And then, you're sort of teetering on the edge there as to whether or not it'll pass. But I would say, any simplification is an improvement.
I disagree. I don't think simpler is better. For example, the 25% flat tax for businesses, I think that disproportionately will help wealthy businesses that normally pay more and disproportionately hurt small startup businesses that would pay less because their owners are not as wealthy. So I think, if you had a small business, you were previously paying 20% in taxes, now you pay 25%, that could be huge, and that could honestly stall job creation, that could stall people that could stop people from creating small businesses, that could stop small businesses from operating or operating efficiently, and I think that's a huge issue. It's simpler, but it's less fair.
So you think it'd be a wake-up call to some of those small business owners that voted for Trump, maybe?
Yeah, I do.
David?
Sure. I suppose it could be. If their taxes ended up being raised, I don't think they'd be too happy about it.
All right. Pay attention here. Okay, one of the biggest challenges is a new flat 25% tax rate for S corporations or pass-through businesses, which, as Matt explained, are currently taxed at the income level of their owners. Now S corporations are by far the most numerous types of businesses in this country, and at the moment, most of them, as Rachel said, are taxed below 25%, so this will be a pretty significant increase for most corporations. Also, the top 1% of S corporations, usually owned by the extremely wealthy, make up 40% of the wealth generated by pass-throughs, and they should see their taxes cut by almost half. So how do the Republicans explain this plan? Kind of what we were just talking about. I mean, this should affect the rich. It's going to be a major tax cut for the rich, people like President Trump himself. David?
Right. Well, I think maybe that's one of the issues with this plan, and certainly messaging is going to be important. President Trump ran on a platform of sort of cutting taxes and creating wealth back for the middle class, and now it turns out, his economic advisor Gary Cohn couldn't guarantee, right, that Trump's taxes himself wouldn't be cut. So I don't think that would look too great for the president.
Yeah, I think this plan actually hurts the middle class exclusively because they're the ones with small businesses. They're the ones who now have to pay more. So I think at least this aspect of the plan exclusively hurts middle class people.
So where do we go from here? Are Democrats going to fight to keep a status quo? Are they going to present their own new plan? What do you think's next?
I think that just based on speculation, they might just go with this because I think it could be a lot worse. For example, things like the child exemptions are better for the poor, and I think that maybe is one of the Democrats' priorities. And so they did work with the president on this plan. I think, honestly, the Democrats, and I feel like if I maybe were them, I agree, would take what they can get.
David, quick thought?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's very tricky, when President Trump came into office, he had a real chance to be kind of a different kind of president, sort of governing in a way outside of the two-party structure, and he could have gotten a lot of things done. And so far, obviously, he hasn't accomplished very much. And hopefully tax reform is something that a lot of people have been counting on, and hopefully it gets done. But on the other hand, for Democrats, midterms are coming up, even though it seems like we did just have a presidential election. Midterms are always around the corner. And if the president hasn't gotten anything done, Democrats probably have very little incentive to sort of give him a helping hand in sort of getting his one major legislative accomplishment across the finish line.
Right. Great. Rachel Frazin and David Gernon, thank you so much for joining us. A special guest and our final word right after this.
At Northwestern, we're wildcats in every way.
Go Northwestern, break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, spread for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
Many in Puerto Rico are still without power weeks after Hurricanes Irma and Maria hit the island. Joining us now is Northwestern first-year student and NNN staffer Maria Arias. Maria grew up in Puerto Rico and came to Northwestern just days before the first hurricane struck. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi.
So Maria, can you tell us what's going on with your family, what they're going through, and what it's like right now for people on the island?
Well, right now my family is okay, but you know, I'm pretty happy to my family's fine, but the island is not right now. Many people are without power. My family just got their water back, and you know, it's a terrible time. It's a time of crisis.
Right, and you were telling me before that you had just spoken with your dad before this. Could you maybe talk a little bit about personally how your family is dealing with it?
Well, I talked to my dad today for the first time, as in we had a good conversation, because we could talk on the phone before, but we had terrible connection, so it would be a 5-minute conversation. I'd just be interpreting sounds because I couldn't really hear him well, and he was telling me about how there was basically no power anywhere on the island. They've been sleeping over at some friends' houses. Sometimes people would sleep over at our house because, you know, I don't know, the community's trying to stay together. But apart from that, the island's doing pretty badly. My dad he represents a dialysis company, and he was trying to get diesel for some hospitals because everything is powered by electric generators, and the line for the diesel is incredibly long. It's 2 hours for anyone to get even gas for their cars, and if you don't have cash money, then you can't buy anything because credit cards aren't working. So it's kind of
Right.
incredible lines and stuff.
Definitely. Now we go to Andrew with our final word.
All right, thank you, Tyler, and thanks again to Maria for talking with us this evening. The views expressed in this segment are not necessarily the views of NNN or Northwestern University. They are the views of the Politicat editorial staff. President Trump was in Puerto Rico today, the first time he's made it down to the island since the disaster. This is just 3 days after he tweeted about, quote, such poor leadership ability by the mayor of San Juan and others in Puerto Rico, unquote, a tweet for which he was widely criticized. Today, Mayor Carmen Yulín Cruz told CNN that her meeting with Trump was productive, but she wishes he would stop bad-mouthing the Puerto Rican people, calling him the, quote, miscommunicator-in-chief. How was Trump able to talk so negatively about Puerto Rico in the first place? Can you imagine him talking this way about the Gulf states during Hurricane Harvey? These were both natural disasters affecting U.S. citizens, but unfortunately, an alarming number of people don't realize that Puerto Ricans are actually U.S. citizens. A Morning Consult poll published in the New York Times found that nearly half of adults don't know that Puerto Ricans are, in fact, U.S. citizens, even though they have been since Woodrow Wilson's presidency back in 1917. Obviously, the president knows that Puerto Ricans are Americans, yet there's still this feeling of otherness. It's as if, because they speak a bit more Spanish than we do, they can be treated with less respect. We're here to tell you that's not the case. Xenophobia and American exceptionalism are dangerous and insulting. To be so degrading to people simply because they're different is wrong. And let me reiterate, these are Americans who have faced the worst Mother Nature has to offer. 95% of Puerto Rico is still without power. Cell reception is spotty at best. Supplies are starting to flow now, but the cleanup will take a very long time. Tomorrow, President Trump is headed to Las Vegas. At the top of this show, we said we were not going to politicize that, and we won't. We just hope that our leader shows leadership. Tyler?
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you for joining us for this edition of Politicat. Good night.